It's August the 19th, 1991.
This is Radio Moscow World Service. The State Emergency Committee has...
The Berlin Wall has crumbled, and across Eastern Europe, communist regimes have been toppling like dominoes. The Soviet Union still stands, but in Moscow, behind the red walls of the Kremlin, a battle is being fought for control of the party and the country.
I was in my hotel room. I was there actually with my husband, and we were just getting up when the phone went in our room. We'd contacted the previous day a rather well-known dissident woman, and she said, "Have you heard the news?" So we said...
A coup d'etat had in fact taken place. A group of hardline communists opposed to Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms had taken power and placed the General Secretary under house arrest at his dacha in the Crimea.
Troops were on the move. This was not a joking matter. An armoured car was parked on Red Square. There were tanks rolling in file along the embankment, which was our hotel overlooked. And in the evening, it became apparent that crowds were gathering at the White House, getting bigger and bigger by the minute. There were not just hundreds, but thousands of people were starting to gather there.
Cheers and calls you can hear behind me. A column of ordinary passers-by from Moscow, they say they are.
State TV and radio censored their coverage of events. Independent Soviet broadcasters were taken off the air. So how did the pro-democracy demonstrators gathering in front of Russia's parliament building know what was going on? How did people know there was a growing demonstration that they could come out and join? The BBC's Russian service was still on the air.
If you went through the crowd, you could hear the call signs of the different radio stations, and you realised that people actually were tuned in to the wave bands of the foreign stations all the time, out in the streets, in the crowds, with a little transistor pressed to their ears.
Next day, early in the morning, I came to White House. It was on the 20th.
That's Efim Barban, another BBC Russian service journalist who found himself caught up in the biggest story of his career. He'd arrived from London the previous day, and by the time he got to the White House, it had been completely taken over by the pro-democracy demonstrators. Efim's BBC ID card was enough on its own to get him through the barricades that had sprung up around the Parliament building.
It was very strange that it was possible for me to get in the White House showing my BBC pass, because it was practically forbidden for the aliens to come to White House.
Why do you think they let you through?
Because you know that the BBC and Radio Liberty were only two radio stations gave any information about Gorbachev and about coup.
When he got inside, Efim found that the anti-coup demonstrators had even set up a dedicated office for the BBC and Radio Liberty. But getting information out was not so easy. The coup plotters had left phone lines open. That was probably their biggest mistake, but still, making international calls to London was bound to arouse suspicions. So Efim and his colleagues duped Moscow's central telephone exchange into thinking that they were calling from Helsinki.
Only once they asked me where I'm calling from. I told them, in Helsinki, not in Moscow. Only this trick helped me to send something there.
Local Soviet journalists whose newspapers had been closed down or whose radio stations had been taken off the air quickly found ways around the censorship. They distributed samizdat news bulletins, photocopied onto A4 sheets and pasted them onto public buildings or faxed them to foreign broadcasters.
All of this was an extremely risky activity from their point of view, because to start with, you weren't supposed to stick up unauthorised posters around the town. And secondly, you weren't allowed to use photocopiers without authorisation. In fact, they were kept under lock and key, and their use was carefully controlled and carefully scrutinised.
One of Elizabeth Robson's contacts, a librarian with reformist sympathies, made her photocopier available to the protesters. But the photocopier had an alarm attached.
At dead of night, the head of the local militia came round, and he said to her, "Ekaterina Yuryevna, your alarm has gone off. I've come to see what's happened." And she said, "Yes, I know it's gone off. I'm responsible for that, and I take total responsibility for everything that's happening inside the library." And he looked at her very hard, and he said, fine, just make sure no light shows, and went away. I mean, that was one of those moments that made you realise that it wasn't just a sort of minority of liberals who were trying to change things. It was actually a much more deep-rooted change that had taken place. And if even a senior figure in the militia could behave like that, then anything was possible in a good direction. It was an amazing moment, actually.
After 3 days, the coup attempt began to collapse, and the plotters were eventually arrested.
Когда первый раз через BBC охрана, приспособив старые приемники, нашла какие-то...
Back in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev said it had been the BBC's Russian service that had kept him up to date as events unfolded in the capital while he was under house arrest in his Crimean dacha. Shortly afterwards, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet leader, and not long after that, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. For Efim Barban, it had been a momentous few days.
I am absolutely sure that these 3-4 days, the most important days in the life of the Russian service of the BBC. Because even if this Russian service exists only these 3 days, its existence would be justified. A historical task would be fulfilled.
This is a controversial point. The idea that the World Service or any of its foreign language services broadcasts with a political aim in mind is something that the BBC and the British government has always rejected. Elizabeth Robson, who went on to become the head of the Russian service at the start of the Putin era, says the aim was more subtle.
I suppose underneath the reporting was the desperate hope that the beginnings of democracy, the beginnings of openness, that hope was always there, that what we were doing would encourage that. But it wasn't in any specific sense that one said, rise up and overthrow your masters, but we were saying there are other ways of doing things, think about it. And I feel that's what Russia needs now.
After 65 years on air, the Russian service will stop broadcasting at the end of this week.
Elizabeth Robson and Efim Barban were speaking to Gabriel Gatehouse for Witness.